Help me welcome to the finest podium in Minneapolis, Jaylani Hussein.
Well, I'm really honored to be here today. I've been to a few Rotaries in my past. Actually, my first early experience in speaking to groups were at Rotary Club. So you guys were the first ones to welcome me when I had a lot of jitters up here. And I'm really glad to be here with you today. And in the next about 30 minutes, I just want to provide as much of just a basic content as possible. And hopefully answer some of your questions here today. I'm the Executive Director of CAIR, the largest civil rights organization in the country, the Minnesota chapter. I've been at that post since 2015. We primarily focus on three primary areas, really educating the general public about Islam and Muslims, but also educating the Muslim community, and particularly the newer East African community, about their rights. So today I'm going to go through two quick presentations, two big topics that I thought I could probably combine together and give you a little bit of just a summary of them. Typically, the presentation that I'm giving takes about an hour to go through, but I'm going to shorten it because I feel like you guys are a bunch of bright bulbs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of stand over here so you can kind of pay attention to the slides. So CAIR, we are as I mentioned, we have 35 chapters across the United States. Actually, this past weekend, we had our national council meeting, and over 200 staff showed up to that meeting. But we are similarly to the NAACP with the ACLU combined, so we do both legal and advocacy. And today, a lot of times, you can find our organization on some headlines. As I mentioned, we focus on three primary areas: enhancing the understanding of Islam through trainings and workshops. And so this presentation is part of training that we do each year. Last year, we did close to 7,000. We trained or spoke to about 7,000 people in Minnesota. Most of those trainings came unsolicited, so we are not even at the point of soliciting. There's a greater demand for understanding this community. We also do educate the Muslim community on Know Your Rights presentations, but also generally on civic engagement and many others. So we train communities, and we spend a lot of time doing that, but we also do legal work. And our office right now has 2 full-time lawyers. We get close to about 200 cases a year. Last year, about 270 cases that we've actually handled. We refer out a lot of cases because we don't focus anything outside of the civil rights, civil liberties area. So criminal law, housing, some other issues we typically push up. Some of these statistics are a little bit off, but mainly the biggest area is employment issues, accommodations basically, whether it's dress or prayer. And then also the other area you see, government agencies. The big inflation there is really FBI representation. The Muslim community gets a lot of house visits from the FBI, and as any of you know, if the FBI knocking your door, probably should contact a lawyer. And by the way, it happens a lot where people just don't know. I'll give you an example, hypothetical example that actually kind of happened, where someone answered the phone or answered a call from the FBI that said, "Do you know Ali?" He said, "Yeah, I know Ali." Well, I didn't know which Ali the FBI was really talking about, so he's now part of the investigation. And eventually they bring him and he's like, "You know Ali?" And he's like, "I've never seen that guy in my life." Well, they have a picture of him standing at a cashier register looking at Ali and saying hi to him. And they said, "Well, that's the first time I saw him." But the point is, people need representation. I know some of you are here and lawyers working. The other area we see also is accommodations with land use issues, especially with cities. So how many of you guys heard of cemetery issues or the last cemetery case, right? So some of you heard that with Chisago County. Last year it was in Lakeville Township area, Castle Rock Township. So land use is another of those huge battles that we struggle with. Every time there's a new mosque or new community center, particularly a cemetery, we get a lot of opposition. And typically, that opposition is coming from not necessarily the community that actually, where the land use issues are. A lot of times it's organizing that happens from outside to that community and starts to create this tension within. So that's kind of what we do. As every presenter, I always have to have some questions, right? So no right or wrong. Some of these are tricky. We made them to be tricky, so And I know Abdurrashid is here, so Abdurrashid, you cannot help anybody. All right, so first question. True or false, 25% of U.S. Muslims are born in the U.S.?
True.
False. False wins. It's really close to 60%. So 60% of U.S. Muslims are actually born here. Muslims worship, according to Muslims worship the same God as those of the Jewish faith. True, yes. Only women have to dress modestly in Islam. False. Typically when I give this, all the women are like, false. And it is false. Men also have to dress modestly in Islam. And actually the verse in the Quran that talks about modesty, there's two identical verses, one for the men first and one for the women. Islam is the fastest growing religion in the United States.
True.
True. Muslim men do not shake women's hands. False. False. True. This one's a tricky one. It depends. So one advice that we always give people is let them lead. You never know how that person feels comfortable. So, but typically in a Muslim culture, you wouldn't, in a Muslim society, you would not shake the opposite genders. Muslims pray 6 times a day. False. 5 times a day, but there are 6 numbers. If you ever see a Muslim calendar, prayer times are 6 because the first prayer's ending time is also added on there. Muslims do not eat shellfish or pork. False. True? False. Neither? There's a trick one in there, and that's the shellfish. So Muslims eat anything in the ocean, really, including the sharks. But we don't eat pork, or byproducts. So just a quick start, but most of you know Muslims around the world are very diverse. A third of the population of the Muslim world actually comes from one area. India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh has a third of all the Muslim populations. And in the United States, the Muslims are considered to be the 2nd largest religious group right now, right after Christianity at 7 million. When we look at that number of the U.S. Muslims, the number actually is kind of quietly divided. A third is the South Asian community, as I mentioned, which already represent a third of the Muslim population, so from India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. And then the second group, which a lot of people don't, especially here in the Midwest, we barely even have a good contact on, is the African American Muslims. It is historically reported that about 10%, close to 30%, between 10 to 30% of all of the African American slaves that came to the United States were Muslim. In the East Coast, you'll find a greater number of East African American Muslims, but they actually represent a third of the American Muslim population. And some of you may be well informed, as we lost the great Muhammad Ali last year, a lot of people kind of woke up like, oh, there's actually African American Muslims. We're not all newly arrived Indians. There was a recent study done just most recently, and some of the highlights of that, and I'll go through some of it as well. This poll just talked about kind of the big highlight. Muslims are the youngest faith community, so we have a very young population. One statistic said that 50% of the Muslim population is under the age of 20 in the United States. We face similar challenges. Interesting enough, even with this past election, less politically engaged, but equally invested. Feel negative toward the climate, obviously with what's been happening. And then also very resilient, and then as many define struggles with women, Muslim women are very resilient. So again, looking at the numbers, Muslim community again being one of the youngest of all the faith traditions. Very diverse community. If you ever go to any of our suburban mosques, you'll see pretty much a reflection of the entire community. You'll have Native American Muslims, you'll have Asian Muslims, you'll have African American, African, South Asian, and Norwegian. So here's a short video we're going to play. It just kind of talks about Muslims being normal, like we also recycle.
American Muslims are an integral part of our society. You see Muslims in media, in comedy, in acting, in medicine, law, engineering, business. They're engaged in politics. They're engaged in starting their own organizations that are benefiting the community. So Muslim Americans are really tapped into almost every sector imaginable. They're job creators. 24% have started their own companies. American Muslims are largely middle class and mainstream.
American Muslims are like other Americans, with comparable percentages watching entertainment television, following professional or college sports, and recycling household materials. The U.S. government estimates the American Muslim population at around 7 million.
There are Muslims who have immigrated from literally every other part of the earth. It would be impossible to talk about Muslims in America without talking about African Americans. So you have an extremely diverse pool of ethnic and national diversity.
They are as likely as the average American to attend a religious service, as likely to say that religion is important to them. They're actually slightly more likely to believe that people of other faiths have a chance at salvation.
1/3 of American Muslims report working to solve a problem or improve a condition in their community. 75% have donated to or assisted local charities.
Muslim doctors decided to establish a compassion network of medical professionals who provide medical services and healthcare free of charge to everybody, to a person of Islamic background, Jewish or Christian, or person who have no faith.
There are more than 20,000 Muslim physicians in the United States, and they operate over 100 free medical clinics around the country.
And actually here in Minnesota, we have 3 free clinics. Historically speaking, this area is uniquely interesting, the Midwest, when it comes to history. The Midwest is home to some of the oldest, at least known Muslim mosques and communities. So on the left here, this is still standing. This is called the Mother Mosque. It is in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. It was formed in 1934, kind of a museum now. And then on the right here, at the top, you can see this was the initial building structure in Ross, North Dakota, which is in Minot. Interesting enough, through all these presentations, I finally met somebody from Ross, North Dakota. And I caught myself, I was like, in the middle of nowhere. She's like, no, it's not. So now I got permission to say it's in the middle of nowhere. But anyways, now they have a museum. And this was actually predates this mosque in 1929. Anybody know where did these people come from? Just as a guess? No, I mean countries. What countries? Lebanon and Syria. So there were Syrian immigrants here in the 20th century, and the early Muslims. And actually in Minnesota, we do have images of Muslim salesmen who were traveling across the state in the late 1800s, 1880, 1870s. So Muslims have been here for a very long time. The first president to be thought of being a Muslim was actually, does anybody know? Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson was thought to be Muslim. Obviously, he was thought to be many things, but at the time that he was thought. And the main reason was because of his connections to the Muslim world, but also him owning a copy of the Quran. So this idea that Muslims are kind of a new community is, I think, a little bit of rewriting history. When we look at statistics here in Minnesota particularly, going back to, again, the 1800s where we have Syrian or Lebanese immigrants, then we start to see, obviously, in the 1930s, not a lot of numbers, but in the 1990s is when really Minnesota started to see the largest number of Muslims. 1960s, you actually had a lot of international students, and they were the ones that kind of laid the foundations here in the Twin Cities, Minnesota, for some of the earliest mosques that are here. But in the 90s, you had immigration from the Bosnian community and my community, the Somali American community. We started to come around that time. And most of the reasons why we came, the Somali community or the East African community, a lot of people ask that question. Well, first of all, let's just recognize that Minnesota is a great place to be. Right? So you always ask, well, okay, well, Minnesota's a great place to be. But really it's been jobs. Jobs have been a big impact for people. People who are brandly new to the country, who have to go figure things out. They can come to Minnesota, they can go to Wilmer, and on Monday they can get a house, and on Wednesday they'll have a job. That has been the biggest draw to people to come to Minnesota. And in addition to that, the family connection, and then on the bottom 100 is the weather. Well, you get used to it, right? You get used to it. Here's some words that often get misconfused. So Islam and Muslims, there are a clear difference. Islam is the religion, Muslims are those who practice it. So you could have somebody who's an Islamist or Islam people, but really the word appropriate is Muslims. Obviously a mosque or masjid is where Muslims pray. Imam is the religious leader. It does not necessarily distinguish that he's a rabbi. There's no formal process for somebody to be an imam. It's much more of just a collective kind of understanding. And hijab is typically a habit or what a Muslim wears. The idea that Muslims believe that Islam is a continuation of the Abrahamic faith. We don't believe this is a new religion, a new process. In addition to that, Muslims, these are the 6 articles that Muslims believe. They believe in one God, they believe in angels, they believe in prophets that came, books of Revelation, including the Bible and the Torah, Day of Judgment, the divine will of God. The word, a lot of times, is the word Allah. A lot of times people don't understand what that means. It's the Arabic word for the God, the one God. So if you're a Christian and you wanted to say God in Arabic, you would say Allah. That's just how it works. A lot of people just get confused with the wording and not getting conceptually changed. Now the 5 pillars, and I'm going to go through this real quick. I'm just going to show you the first one, the prayer, which is the one we have the biggest in, and a little bit of fasting. Muslims obviously, just like everybody else, have to pray. Part of really connection to God. It's a place to reflect each day 5 times a day. And for me, it's a place to whine. If you're going to whine to somebody, you might as well whine. Before you have to pray, you have to make what is called wudu, ritual cleansing, where it involves washing your hands, washing your face, and then eventually washing your feet. So if you ever see somebody who's taking a mini bath, probably it's because they're actually doing wudu. And so with the washing of the feet, some of you have heard about that. People don't have difficulty with that. It gets difficult. You have to wash your feet in a sink that's pretty high. Now imagine if you're a woman wearing, a skirt or something like that. It's even double high. There are some other workarounds, but typically that's something you do. What does an actual prayer look like? Here's the 5 typical stages of a prayer. And so people could be in these positions. And that would be considered one full cycle of a prayer. And people may ask, sometimes wandering around, where's northeast? Now we have compasses, but people, and that's the direction people face. Where do Muslims typically pray? Muslims pray in a place that's clean, quiet, reasonably quiet, semi-private. It does not have to be a sanctuary. It doesn't have to be a closed or a sanctuary. Early morning, right before sunrise, and then after that, the next one is really around lunchtime. And then third one's late afternoon, sunset, and at night. What's the challenge? The challenge is Minnesota, things move around pretty fast. So in July, your sunset prayer is 8:53, and in December, it's 4:33, which means the entire year, that schedule closely moves. And actually, that's where we get a lot of our issues with just not understanding. Employer not understanding, an employee not able to effectively communicate their prayer schedule. So we've had a number of cases where individuals were fired because they asked to pray and they were told, well, you haven't been praying like this for the last 6 months. And it's like, well, have you looked outside the last 6 months? Things have been a little different, right? And if you want to know how to know, there's an app for it, right? We all have an app that goes off and tells you when the prayer is. Friday prayer is our Saturday or Sunday congregational prayers, and typically they take about 30 minutes. And because today's Friday, I'll be going to the later one, which is at 2 o'clock. So again, just to show you, fasting is another one. This year, Ramadan is from May 25 to June 25. So in each year it moves 13 days. So this is the first time it probably will be, it's been long the last few years, but also it will be around the end of the school year as well. Typically, again, it's a commandment from God. It's fasting. What do people actually really do? Not eat, not drink. Those are the big things that everybody remembers. But really, also, it's a month for opportunity for staying away from sin and all of other things. So you literally can break your fast if you're going after people, punching them, fighting them, swearing at them, whatever. All of those things that you typically should not be doing if you engage them, they could also be a reason for breaking your fast. But there's exceptions to all of this, right? If you're pregnant, if you're traveling, if you're this, if you're that, if you're taking medication, et cetera, et cetera. So with that, I'm going to actually switch over presentations just to show you a little bit about Islamophobia and that whole entire conversation, which we talk extensively about. Because I think, just to give you a little bit, and then we'll go to question and answer. So, Islamophobia is a big thing now, but I wanted just to kind of clarify one thing. It's, you know, it's this new wave of really misunderstood, leading to hate. And so it's kind of a cycle. It starts off with obviously ignorance generated, and also bad information, not only online, but on movies and other things. There is an actual industry now because of the ignorance on Islam and Muslims that exists in our state and in our country, that people are starting to become the experts, the pseudo-experts on this topic. You know, nobody knows anything about it, so here I am telling you something about it. It really, some of the fears and some of the issues around Islamophobia is also based on historical religious intolerance. So if you're a Catholic Irish in this room, you've probably seen some of the same statistics or same strategies used against your community not too long ago, among other communities, Jewish American community members. And then it's an organized group. I think that's the part a lot of people just don't understand. You know, there's a part of just ignorance and just people just not knowing, but really right now the challenge is in the organized, and that leads to hate crimes. So there are recent studies of, this is 2014, that looked at Muslims in the United States compared to other faith groups. Muslims were the last group, right below the atheist. So ignorance is a big part. Obviously, Hollywood plays a big role. You know, we haven't had our sitcom. You know, how many of you guys watched Fresh Off the Boat? It's kind of a really cool. Takes me back to all my '90s childhood years. It's about a Chinese family and just going through their roots. Those have a big impact on, again, perception and ideas. We haven't had that. We have 24 and Homeland and all of the things about ticking bomb, and those have a big impact on how people perceive Muslims and how Islamophobia is understood. The idea, the #1 targeted community who's not Muslim on Islamophobia, do you know who it is? The Sikh community. And do you know why? Because their Sikh men wear turbans for religious purposes. But we have been trained through Hollywood for a long time that Muslim men wear turbans. In the reality, unless you're in North Africa, and in some part of the world where they wear it for fashion, turbans are really not in the Muslim community, right? There's not a really religious aspect to it. If they may wear something called a kufi, a smaller, something like that, looks like a yarmulke, very small. But again, those are the perceptions. So actually after September 11, and even now, the Sikh community comes under attack because they're perceived to be Muslims. Many of you would say New York Times is a great resource, and technically it is. But look at a study that was done, and looked at a 25-year period, identifying the words Islam and Muslims in headlines, and whether that article was positive or negative. And what they realized is the average for all the other topics, like the Yankees, Republican, religion, liberal, whatever, right? All of the topics, the average was 30% negative. When it came to Islam and Muslims, it was close to 60%. So if you read the New York Times for 25 years, you would have a negative perception of Muslims. That's the unfortunate reality. Media, the only thing, #1 story in the media is international terrorism. That's the #1 story on the news. How is that going to perceive people? How is that going to impact how people are perceived? When current President Donald Trump mentioned that he's going to ban Muslims from coming to the United States, he didn't say it in a vacuum. He didn't say it, he said it because 2/3 of the GOP primary voters at that time completely agreed with that statement. It's an industry, and it's both left and right. It's not, the Republican or the extreme conservative party that are perpetrating Islamophobia. They may be in volume-wise, but it's on both sides. So here's Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She wrote a book. She wrote many books, and she's someone who, again, speaks to that group that would be considered on the left, progressive, and here on the right. And they both have the same idealistic message, which is there's something inherently wrong with Islam. But anybody who doesn't know anything about Islam wants to ask real questions. Just because you don't know does not mean we punish you and call you an Islamophobe, right? So people who have curiosity shouldn't be labeled that. Again, religious history, we've had this before, it's returned, we have to fight it again. And I'll end here and say, as you can tell, this is the same issues that communities have faced, religious communities have faced, and Muslims today are facing exactly the same thing. Organized hate, denial of public accommodations, employment discrimination, and then in 2015 we saw for the first time the increase of attacks of mosques. And I'm just going to get, so we have this report on our website, islamquery.org, that kind of addresses all these different issues. And if you look here, we identified that there are about 70 organizations that actually engage in this anti-Muslim organizing nationally. And just 33 of them do really, this is their bread and butter work. And just those 33 in the last from a study that looked at between 2008 and 2013 said that they're actually well-funded, over $205 million spent. Not only that, but also about $30 to $40 million annually. That's from the public record, so there's a lot of information that's not included. What is their strategy? What do they really want to do? Again, they want to frame American Muslims as dangerous to America. That's how they use it. They use fake statistics, alternative facts, fake news, name it. Right? These are what really the organizing groups are using. They're also well connected, and they support each other. And here's an example. Here's a gentleman who supported or created the anti-Sharia bill. He said something like this: "There's a reason for founding fathers to not give women or blacks the right to vote." You're gonna say something like that? I don't know. That should be taking advice from you. But he started it, and then he gave it to those organizations. Then they gave it to their state legislators. It became law. All those blue states it was introduced, and it became law in the pink states. Minnesota, we defeated it quickly within the same day, that bill. And some of the fears are around these topics were very kind of outdated. That for some reason this state representative said that he's worried about American Muslims, or how many of our sisters and daughters who attend American University are now American Muslim men. If you change that from Muslim to black or any other code, we've seen those. And then also just conceptualizing things, right? Words and other things. So the word, for example, struggle, many of us don't have a panic attack, but when we hear the word jihad, it's like, oh my God, holy war. How many of you heard of holy war and jihad? Most of us. Do you know in Arabic what the word holy war is? It's not jihad. Holy war in Arabic is al-harb al-muqaddas. Nobody ever heard of al-harb al-muqaddas, and it doesn't exist really. But the reality is jihad has been translated in the United States, or especially in our Western democracies, as holy war, but that's not the case, right? And again, those are the type of how perception, not understanding, play a big role. And in Minnesota, we have actually dealt with this. Anti-Muslim speakers have been coming here. They kind of made it Minnesota their home. This guy actually comes a lot. He came to Bloomington a couple times ago, and also across the state. And this starts to increase the fear. Fear, organizing starts to happen. Issues in St. Cloud. How many of you heard of issues in St. Cloud? Well, there are issues in St. Cloud. And unfortunately, those issues are not just about the Muslim community, but also anybody who's supporting the Muslim community. As you can see, here's a billboard that went out attacking Catholic charities. There are actually armed rallies. You had the mess up here with the license plates not too long ago from that area as well. But the good news is things are also changing in St. Cloud. Positive things are happening. People are organizing. Communities are coming together. The governor was there a couple of times. But it's a small town, rural town. How many of you come from St. Cloud? Anybody here from St. Cloud? All right. So it's a small town, rural town. People still have rumors. Rumors are real. You know, it's the old version of fake news was rumors. And so St. Cloud Times does a lot of fact checks. Even rumors are around our organization, and they fact checked us. CAIR or not, U.S. terror watch us. Again, there are many incidents that have happened. I'll just brush through them. We had actually 4 major hate crimes that happened in March, all in Minnesota, from Moorhead to St. Cloud, and 2 here in the Twin Cities. So with that, I'll just end and just say our strategies of fighting back are really getting around to share our stories, our narratives, and tell people who the American Muslim community is. I'll give you an example. Here are some people that you don't see. The CEO of Medtronic is Muslim, the first ever congressman, Keith Ellison. Black Lives Matter, a leader back a few years ago in St. Paul, school board members, and the young kids you never hear about. How many of you guys ever heard about young Somali kids joining the United States Army? You always hear about them joining some terrorist organization, unfortunately. But I have 3 of my close friends who are part of the United States Army and the Navy, and they've served very proudly. You don't hear those stories. And when you hear all of the negative stories, we have a very ugly perception. We have the Islamophobia starts to become something reality. So with that, I would like to just open up if we have.
Well, Jaylani, we're past 1:15.
All right.
Thank you.